Okay, so why do we want to learn about the mind or learn to train the mind? Because we are sentient beings, as Scott asked this question. Where do we draw the line? We can get into, but we know that we are sentient beings, right? How do we know that? Because we experience suffering and happiness, right? We experience things, and those things are experienced with the faculty, one of the mental factors called, we can, in the English, there are always so many different translation options. It's one of the challenges of uh, learning Buddhism in 2025, but hey, so what? It's still new. We'll get through it. But we call it a feeling, we can call it valence, we can call it affect, right? Or the Sanskrit Vedana, right? Vedana. Okay, so this is the faculty or the function of every moment of any given mind, which is experiencing as pleasant, unpleasant, as happy, unhappy, or neutral, somewhere that's can't really say it's pleasant, can't really say it's unpleasant. It's just there as an experience. Okay, so we are sentient, and well, what does that mean? Just by nature, just by nature. There's not really any deeper reason to it. Again, it's just verified through our own experience. We like the happy experiences. We don't like the unhappy ones. So then we have to, if we, there's certain things we like and certain things we don't like, as is the nature of any living being. You want more of the likable ones and less of the unlikable ones. What fuels every what fuels every decision and activity in the world is living beings trying to get more of the things they like and less of the things they don't like, right? So trying, right? Not always successfully, but that's why we have to learn about the mind. Why? Because the mind creates and conditions whether we experience happiness or suffering. Okay. And of course, happiness and suffering are mind themselves, right? So it makes sense that mind, right? Mental states, mental actions, mental activity, that those are conditioning our happiness and suffering, since happiness and suffering are within the mind itself. Okay, now, how does the mind create or influence our experiences? How does that happen? Okay, big picture again, big picture. There are several ways. Some are more subtle, some are less subtle. Okay, so let me just cover kind of four basic ways in which the mind creates or influences, really creates, but we can also say influences the world, but our experience of the world. Of course, that raises the question, is there a world outside of the experience of the world? But we won't get into that question right now. So the least subtle way, so the most obvious way in which the mind creates and influences our experience is through judgments, right? The thoughts we hold about someone or something, right? When we have a judgment, a self-judgment, oh, I'm so dumb, I'm lazy, I can't get out of my bad habits, I'm stuck in this rut. You have a negative judgment. It makes us, right, see ourselves in this negative light, create suffering. We have a negative judgment of another person. Oh, they're evil, they're stupid, they're hateful, everything they do is harming people, right? Then every time we see that person, immediately we feel suffering. We feel irritation, right? Maybe even hatred. Okay, so this is one way in which our experience is influenced. And likewise, when we have, right, a positive view of someone, oh, they're so wonderful, they're so kind, they're so funny, they're so beautiful, then we see them and we immediately feel happy, right? We're pleased by their presence. And of course, many other, right? We all can observe our own experience to see all the other experiences that come along when we have judgments. Okay, a slightly more subtle, okay, way of mind influencing our experience is through our perceptions, okay, through our perceptions. Now, I'm not really using like the most technical Buddhist terminology right now, just kind of general terminology, just so you know. So perceptions that sort of means prejudgment perception is what I mean here. So for instance, right, sometimes you'll literally just see someone for the first time before having made any, conceptual analysis and judgment, but you just are attracted to them. Like they look nice, or they look beautiful, or that, you like their appearance, or the opposite, right? They look like a jerk. They look mean, right? They look, something about them you don't like. That's just in your visual perception. They just appear as negative or as positive to you, right? Okay. And of course, this is summed up by the basic expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So how do we know the mind is influencing? Is because different people who have different minds, obviously, will have different perceptions, right? So to some person, you see this, whatever, you know, this person you see walking down the street, they look so nice, they look so cool, they look, you like their style, you like their look, you're attracted. Someone else sees them and the complete opposite, right? So you know that it's the mind influencing, because otherwise there would have to be a common shared experience, right? So the variation in experience of different people, that indicates that it's coming from that person's mind. Okay, and do you guys know about the dress, this big social media? It's kind of an amazing thing. I'll just show it for a second because this really illustrates quite nicely just how deep this kind of thing is. So even though it's not the most subtle way in which the mind influences or creates our experience, it's a very deep way. In other words, like what we perceive, we can't like immediately just change it or control it. It really is kind of, in some sense, hardwired on some level, hardwired, right? Doesn't mean it's completely unchangeable forever. But is anyone not familiar with the dress? I could do a screenshot. I have the image of it. So did someone say yes, they're not familiar? Okay, so the dress, I'll just put it up here and the screen share. But what it was a photograph of a dress that roughly one third of human beings see as gold and white, and then the rest of human beings see it as black and blue. So can I get a show of hands who sees it as gold and white? Gold and white dress? Okay, well, a lot of you. And who sees it as black and blue, or some other third option? There we go. See right here. We're seeing how, right, our perceptions are influencing our experience. Okay. Very funny. It's an interesting phenomenon. Okay. Okay. Then another more subtle way, a very subtle way, is when we talk about the dependence of our experiences of actual reality, the dependence of the objects of reality on our conceptual labeling, designation, and social construct. Okay. So for instance, and this actually, for both this one and the previous one, we can look at animals to get a good sense of what's happening here, right? So we could say that for the perception, if you think about the way different animals experience the world, of course, they have different sensory organs to begin with, right? Different systems of perception, so they have very different experiences of things. But also when it comes to the concepts they have in their mind, right? The concepts they have in their mind. Because you look at something like a cat or dog, and generally, they run around in the same space. They occupy the same space we do, our homes, our yards, they see big, if the table's there, they see a table, they can jump on the table, right? Now, but what happens when they see something like their reflection in a mirror, right? Have you ever seen a cat or a dog? Now, I know this is actually something that's not universal across all cats and dogs, so there are, I think, exceptions, but most of them will just like, walk around and walk, as if there's nothing, they don't not recognize the reflection in the mirror, right? So there's something about their lack of having a construct that, oh, this is a reflected image of my own body or, whatever's in front of it that is showing back to me, and I can actually see my own body. They just lack that concept, right? And then who knows what concept they have of chairs and tables, and maybe, I mean, probably different than us, right? And even check your own experience. Now, of course, this is really connected to developmental psychology when we're young infants, before we actually learn the terms for things, before we learn language. You can imagine the experience of the world is very different. There's obviously, you know, decades and centuries of research into how children perceive and then how they learn to perceive like adults and develop language and all the different modalities they develop. But basic point, you can kind of just think about, well, what's the world like when I don't have any concepts of things, right? When I don't really know, like, this is my own body, that's my, that's another person, that's, you know, everything you experience around you. You just have none of these concepts. And you can just kind of maybe more easily get a sense of it by thinking about some object that you've seen in your adult life, if you can think of one. It's an interesting exercise to do, to try to remember, or if you can't remember, to stay aware, so that next time it happens, you'll have the experience and say, oh, okay, I see what's happening. But a time when you see like a physical object, right, like something you can see with your eyes, that you don't know what it is, and just kind of observe how your mind relates to that, right? When you haven't formed the relationship between the kind of a label for something and that, defined object that's there. So this happened to me once. I was sitting in an apartment in New York City, and my friend's apartment, and there was just this little kind of like box, but not like a cardboard box, but like, a cubic object, and it was white, and I was just like, what is that? I kept looking at it, like, so you can see, like, there were concepts for object and white cubic object, and like there were some concepts to roughly get at it, but I couldn't perceive it for what it was because I didn't have the exact label for it, right? And it turned out to be like a tiny dishwasher. Like, that was just not in the right place. It was like, I guess, a portable dishwasher or something. So it was just like in the corner of the room, and it was just very confusing to me. But anyway, you'll see when these kinds of things happen, how your mind reacts. And anyway, the deeper point is that everything that we're experiencing is dependent on having some construct. Okay. And that's very subtle to really see that taking place. Then the next way in which the mind creates a reality and our experience has has many layers of subtlety and obviousness. And this is, which I know Kashima talked about a bit, karma, or action, right? Our mental intentions, and then the actions of body, speech, and mind that occur concurrently with those intentions and are fueled by those intentions, they condition what we experience to a huge degree. And so when I said that there's various spectrum of subtlety just within karma, it's because, like, for instance, right now, I have an intention to say something about karma, to say that it influences our experience. That's a mental intention, okay? That's karma. Immediately after that thought arises, after that intention is there, it sparks something, right? It sparks something in the brain, it sparks something in the consciousness, and then my mouth moves, bam, I say a word. Okay, that's action, that's karma, right? Now you guys hear something, you're understanding something, right? So just that itself is karma influencing our experience, creating our experience, right? It's creating the words I'm saying, and you're hearing those words and having some recognition of them, some recognition of their meaning. Okay, we're sharing the communication itself, right? The fact that we can communicate, that's being created by karma. Okay, that's an obvious level. What's another obvious level of karma? Well, you want to, live. You want to be able to get food and a house and a place to live. and clothing and everything. So what? You want to get money. Okay, so you have to get money. So you want to what? Go and find a job. So you want to find a job. So what? So you have to go get the credentials, the training or the schooling. Okay, so all of that, right? And so then you go through those steps, you get the job, you go to the office, you go to the whatever you're doing, you're a landscaper, you go cut the grass, you're a carpenter, you go, whatever work you do. Obviously, there are thousands of options. You do the work, you get that paycheck. That's karma too, right? It comes from mental intention that fuels your physical action that creates some reality. Okay, now you have a house, now you have a car, right? You do something illegal that harms others. Okay, well, now you're in jail, right? Okay, this is karma too, but that's an obvious level. So what are the subtle levels? The very subtle levels. Okay, it's very subtle because why is it karma so subtle? Why did the Buddha call it? I know Geshe-must mentioned this too. These three different types of knowable objects, based on the way you can access them. The division is made based on the way you can access them. So we have evident phenomena that are sort of directly observable. Then there are slightly hidden phenomena that you have to use reasoning to understand. And then there's extremely hidden phenomena. So in the Buddhist tradition, the Nalanda tradition at least, karma, the cause and effect relation of karma and its result, that's included under the extremely hidden. Why is it? Because that's when we're talking about karma that has a cause in one lifetime and a result in another lifetime or much later in this life. In other words, it's a subtle cause and effect that's occurring over the span of time with a gap. It could even be of a whole lifetime, a gap of a whole, you get rid of one body and have a whole nother body, and still there's this potential of the actions we've done to do what? Create our experience. And that's very, very, kind of, I know it's a sort of very new kind of metaphysics, a new way of looking at the world, new for us as Western people raised with a Western education, to see that, oh, I can, go give a person in need, money or, food, or make an offering, or I can go, I could, if I killed somebody, if I killed an, an insect even, or an animal, I could, right, be actually creating a whole existence. Creating a whole existence. What does that mean? Well, some karmas have the powers, and as Geshe-ma mentioned, that there's different weights, right? Some karma is heavier, some's lighter, but some karmas have the potential, some actions have the potential to create a whole birth. In other words, the fact that we're here as a human being comes from previous actions of doing what? Practicing an ethical way of life, or of engaging in actions that were ethically based. In other words, refraining from harming others. And then that's the main condition to receive or to obtain this human body we have now. So it created our body. Our actions created this experience as a human. Okay, so there's in all of these ways of our mind creating our experience work together. So right, this is the cool thing about Buddhist philosophy, which is really, I think, the most scientific aspect of it. I mean, it's all in line with science, or I should say, any part that isn't can be, I think, modified or rejected. But the basic, again, big picture, even bigger than just psychology, but just everything. What is it? Everything arises from a multitude of causes and conditions, right? So there are many ways in which there are many different aspects to mind, many different varieties of mind and consciousness, and they're all influencing and creating our experience together. Okay. Now I'll continue with this big picture. We have this framework of Buddhist psychology that's outlined in the textbook that we're going through. And has anyone here ever studied or, even learned, I guess just however it feels like to you, what it would mean to learn it, but has anyone here learned about Western psychology, modern Western psychology? little bit, right? I mean, I think most of us have some basic ideas of how, whatever, maybe not even, I don't know, it depends on you, but a lot of us would have some basic idea of, Freud and Jung were sort of the founders of Western psychology, and they had these ideas about, the subconscious and the conscious experience and the different things that drive us. Well, what basic point I'm making now, why is Buddhist psychology so different from Western psychology? And I know that, I mean, those ideas of Freud and Jung are actually not, right, really accepted that widely anymore. So modern psychology is very heavily influenced by neuroscience and understanding of the brain, and that's certainly it's evolved a lot. But anyway, point is, why is Buddhist psychology so different from Western psychology? I don't know. Does anyone there have any idea? Yes, Hans?
Not really an idea, but just thinking because I have not studied Western psychology. Okay. So, but I've studied other things, and I study and I read and I put it away and I move on. That's my Western way of the way I've been educated to do studies. And in Buddhist psychology, it is just not the case. In Buddhist psychology, you go into depths, you go down, 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 and you make sure that whatever is written there, that you understand it properly. And that's the difference. And that's an amazing difference. And it is not an easy one for especially for an old mind like mine, which is, rusty and already within the habits, of everything. It's not easy, but it's exciting.
Right. Very good. Well, actually, that's one I hadn't thought of, but that's a very good point. Is the way that we study it as students, the way we learn it is very different. And well, that's connected to a couple of things which which came to my mind, which would be like the basic motivation for why we're studying it is different, right? So for Buddhist psychology, it really is based in the understanding that this is if we really want to achieve happiness, this is the only option, right? We have to understand our mind from a first person perspective. We have to understand the mind of ourselves, right? And so this is another difference is the kind of approach in terms of what you're actually looking at, what are you actually observing, right? And how do you come to know about it? So it's sort of a difference in epistemology, we can say, right? In Western psychology, the focus has been from the beginning, just starting to shift a little bit now, looking at people other than ourselves, diagnosing their mental illnesses, their issues, right, their flaws, and trying to help them, trying to treat that. So it's not not bad, but neglecting to right observe your own mind and understand it. Whereas Buddhist psychology is the exact opposite, right? We're observing our own minds. Okay. And then another big difference is simply that Buddhist psychology comes from the Buddha. I mean, there was, a spiritually motivated seeker who became what, you know, we understand or he understood to be awakened. And so this kind of state of basically, you know, completely kind of unnaturally healthy mental health, an unnatural kind of degree of mental health that he was able to develop. In other words, something that Western psychology, for to a large part, wouldn't even accept as possible. To have no mental disturbance whatsoever, to have no negative judgments whatsoever, like, but that's what the Buddha developed. And so to have that kind of person be the overarching kind of the lineage comes from, right? He's sort of the founder of Buddhist psychology and the founder of Western psychology again. People like Freud and Jung, and of course, even going back to Aristotle and Plato, those ideas filtered up through time, and then William James and many other players, of course. But point major point is none of them were really motivated by the desire to completely overcome all human suffering. and none of them claim to be able to do it. But the Buddha had both of those, right? Okay. Okay. Now, how are we doing? Does anyone have any question, or should I see? I should be able to get to those two questions pretty soon based on the, the little notes I have outlined here. What's coming up? Okay. So one thing I just want to remind people of too, I know it's come up before, but I don't think in any of the classes so far you've gone into much detail on it. But just so you're aware, okay, when we talk about the mind in Buddhist psychology, it's within this all comes out of the Buddhist text, and for the Nalanda tradition, that really means, of course, the Buddha's sutras, the Buddha's own teaching from when he was alive, but then a variety of commentaries written by Indian scholars who most of them lived and taught and trained at Nalanda University in northern India. And within that, within both the Buddha's own teaching and then the following commentators, we can identify 4 different paradigms of thought. So these are often called the 4 tenet systems, right? The 4 schools of Buddhist thought, but we can call them 4 paradigms in the sense that they're really like completely different ways of looking at the world. Now you might say, well, how could that be? They're all Buddhist. Well, but it's, there are some overlap and they share some things in common. But just like when we talk about scientific paradigms, right? There's a paradigm of, for instance, classical physics, Newtonian physics, and then a paradigm of quantum physics, the new physics, which is already 100 years old, but relatively new and hard to understand. But those are like completely different ways of looking at matter, right? Newtonian physics imagines that matter is made up of tiny little balls that are bouncing against each other, and that's what determines everything that happens in the universe. Right? Modern quantum physics looks at things very differently as being described by, right, a wave function, right, a probability function, and that there are certain properties that can't be known simultaneously. In other words, there's an indeterminacy to the nature of matter. It's a very different way of looking at things. But they share some things in common. They share the basic kind of epistemology of the scientific method and accept that that's a valid way of gaining knowledge. They share basic, a lot of basic assumptions, right? So it's like this with the 4 Buddhist schools or paradigms. So just so you know, there's going to be differences in their approach, in their understandings of certain aspects of psychology. Okay, just so you know, I'm not going to go into them, but I'll just say basically what we're learning here in the textbook we have from Tibet House, and generally when someone's teaching an introduction to Buddhist psychology class, this is, we basically are looking at the what's called the Sautrantika paradigm, the Sautrantika paradigm, basically more or less. And then some aspects of Madhyamaka will come in as well. Okay, very good. Okay, is that all things that ring a bell? Did people remember hearing about these 4 different Buddhist tenets? Should I list them, or could anyone there list them? Okay, go ahead.
There's Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka.
Great. So Vaibhashika, which is in English, we call it Great Exposition School, Sautrantika, or the Sutra School, the Chittamatra, the Mind-Only School, and the Madhyamaka, the Middle Way School. Very good. Okay. Now, what's one thing that they all share in common? Well, the understanding of the basic nature of mind. Okay, so that is one thing that is in common. What is the basic nature of mind? Well, like the textbook says, that's defined as clear and aware, right? Clear and aware. Okay, so this should just be review, right? I think that was already gone through. So another way we could kind of expand this definition to just frankly kind of put it into a phrasing that just is a little bit more intuitive, right? Because just giving like a 2-word definition is not really intuitive as English speakers. It's not how we define things. So we could say it's like a unit of experience which is defined by clarity and awareness. Okay, just the same meaning, but just to phrase it a little differently. What is mind? What is a mind? What is a consciousness? It's a unit of experience defined by clarity and awareness. Okay. And when I say a unit of experience, it's not like we're talking about like a unit of measurement, like, you know, a foot or an inch. It's just the fact that you could talk about like, you know, the mind of a dog. Okay, that's a unit of experience, the mind of a dog. Okay, we can talk about the mind of a human. We could talk about my mind at 6 a.m. this morning. Okay, well, we could talk about, right, as we do, right, the visual consciousness perceiving a white mug, the visual consciousness perceiving a red fire truck, okay, perceiving a tree, the ear consciousness, the auditory consciousness, perceiving, you know, a classic, you know, a song, the Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Like those are all units of conscious experience, units of experience, okay? But it could also be a single instant, right? You could talk about the first moment of a visual consciousness perceiving a white mug, perceiving a tree. So the point is, the mind is in this continuum that's unceasingly being regenerated moment by moment. But when we want to understand it, we can divide it up in many different ways, right? And like we know, there's the 6 basic domains of consciousness. Those are the main minds, right? So that's one way of dividing up our experience. We could also divide it up. Well, there are all these different divisions that will come, like the 7-fold division of mind that we'll go back into in just a minute. So, nature of mind. And so, what's one thing that's very important to understand about the mind and why we're learning so much about it is because in order to train, in order to subdue the unsubdued mind, okay, what do we need to do? We need to learn how to perceive the opposite. Okay, so this is often talked about in terms of using an antidote to overcome a mistaken consciousness or a wrong consciousness. So we can talk about this as like cognitive opposites, right? So now we're talking on the level right now, mental consciousness. This is not something that's really relevant with our sensory consciousnesses because, well, the only consciousness that can meditate, that can intentionally, right, create some experience, some mental image by, you know, wishing it into existence or thinking it into existence. That's the mental consciousness, right? Your sensory consciousnesses are passive. They just take in whatever is put in front of them, okay? Of course, sometimes they're mistaken, so there's conditions that can screw them up, that can mess them up. But, right, it's the mental consciousness that can think, okay, I have this sense that I'm permanent. I have this sense, this basic, right, cognitive backdrop to my life that I'm going to be here tomorrow. Okay, that's grasping at permanence. That is a mental consciousness, a conceptual mind, apprehending myself as permanent. So how do we overcome that? How do we overcome that misperception? What do you think? Do you have that sense? And it's hard to identify. So that's why it's so nice just to talk about it, because now we can start to think, do I have that? Do I have the basic sense somewhere somewhere subtle, in a subtle level, somewhere within me, in the backdrop of my experience, that I'm just going to be here tomorrow, that I'm not going to die? Does that sound like as part of your experience? It's not.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's not conscious until we make it conscious, right? It's consciousness, but it's not conscious. If that makes sense. Okay, it's consciousness, but it's not conscious, right? In other words, we're not, you know, until we make it that way, able to really clearly see it identify it, verbalize it, point it out and say, oh, that's the mind, that's the conceptual mind apprehending me as permanent. It's just, but it's functioning within us. It's there, right? Sort of a background function, right? So what this should tell you is that, I mean, there's so many different areas that you go into when you start learning about the mind. But one of the things this tells you is that there can be many different mental consciousnesses operating simultaneously. Right. So for the sensory consciousnesses, it's more or less like one thing at a time, right? Or at least one basic field of experience. I mean, you could look up and see a room. So there are many colors and shapes that you're experiencing, but it's basically one visual consciousness happening at a time. With the mental consciousness, right? Of course, there's one thing that's sort of strongest and most clear in your mind, but there can be many, many mental consciousnesses actually there in the background. Okay. So, and many of these, and an untrained person who hasn't trained their mind extensively, are going to be mistaken perceptions or mistaken consciousnesses. After training your mind, then, well, what happens? Well, then you have in the background of your mind things like great compassion for all living beings, things like bodhicitta, things like infinite love, right? Things like an understanding that all conditioned phenomena, including myself, are impermanent, that I very well could die tomorrow, or at least that, right, there's no guarantee that I will survive, that I will live tomorrow. Right. So anyway, the perception or the cognition of myself as permanent is the exact opposite, direct opposite of myself as impermanent. Myself is permanent, myself is impermanent. So when you have something like that, the exact opposite, then if you can meditate on, if you could hold in mind the thought, I am impermanent. I can die, I could die tomorrow. I am changing moment by moment. Now, those are different because there's different degrees of permanence, right? There's impermanence. There's subtle impermanence as well as coarse impermanence, but it's the same idea when you're talking about how to overcome the misperception. So then that's the direct opposite. You can't have those in your mind at the same moment because they're direct opposites. It's looking at one object, as Neil mentioned, right? The observed object condition. You're looking at one observed object, but seeing them in opposite ways. One sees it as permanent, one sees it as impermanent, so they can't be in the mind at the same time. That is a fundamental stipulation of Buddhist psychology. And that is the main way, like Geshe-ma's mentioned, Buddhist psychology, implies or even outright asserts that you can basically become your own therapist. Now, it doesn't use that language, but I mean, the traditional texts don't use that language, but essentially, once you learn how the mind functions as an individual, you can apply in your own practice, in your own meditation, these methods and improve your own mental health. That's the basic premise, right? Well, how is that done? It's done by understanding and utilizing this feature of consciousness, that the mind cannot have towards one object, one observed object, you cannot have two opposite cognitions or perceptions of it. Okay? That's how we can develop the understanding and the wisdom of selflessness, the wisdom of emptiness. Oh, is there a question? Go ahead.
Oh, I'm raising my hand for Melinda because I don't think you can see her.
Oh, I can't.
Yeah,
That's right. I was asking for questions, but I can't see half the room.
So you can't hold your mind can hold an intellectual concept that I have two opposites at the same time. But as you do say, like, antidote, and you're thinking about maybe gross impermanences to help you recognize that you're impermanent. You mean that fundamentally deep inside, you're going to either see it one way or the other, because you kind of hold two views while you're working on it.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
So
what Melinda's talking about.
You say that, yeah.
Yeah. What Melinda's talking about, and we'll go back. Oh, yeah. I think I got the question. So we'll go back through the 7. Right. Does everyone have the text, or should I do the screen share so you can see what's on? It's just one page, so I could just show it. Anyway, I'll just show it. Why not? Just to make sure. Okay. So, right, this is the sevenfold division of mind. So what Melinda is actually talking about, as far as I can tell, unless she can correct me if this isn't really getting to it, is this one, number 6, doubting consciousness, right? So a doubting consciousness is a sort of state where you're wavering between, right? It's like, I feel like I'm permanent, I'm not gonna, but I know I'm impermanent. But wait, but I feel like I'm permanent, but I know I'm impermanent, right? It's this sort of wavering, and right, there's doubt that can be sort of evenly divided between two options, like one or the other, like permanent or impermanent. It can be more heavily weighted towards, oh, I really think I'm permanent, but maybe not, right? More weighted towards permanent, or it can be more weighted towards impermanent. Well, I really, really think I'm impermanent, but there's still that tug. But I still feel like I'm permanent a little bit, right? I mean, I say me, but you can talk about any object, like anything you perceive with your eyes, even, right? We don't perceive the subtle momentary change, right? So the perception of the eyes sees things as kind of stable, subsisting, unchanged through time. So you can easily develop the concept of that too, right? The concept would be a mental consciousness, the conceptual consciousness, I should say, not concept, just because it's a little bit of a tricky philosophical area itself. Anyway, so now this is going back through the basic process here, is that you start from a sense without even questioning, just the kind of inborn, right? Because we carry things from previous lives, or even just from the conditioning of this life. And we have this sense that, yeah, I'm going to live tomorrow. What tomorrow? Of course, but you never question it. Then you start to learn about impermanence. You start to reflect. You start to see, oh, wait, but I have this friend. He died when he was 6. I had this other friend died when he was 15. I had this other friend died when he was 20. Wait, people are dying anytime. What? I could die too, right? And then you start to doubt. What? Wait, it can't be certain that I'm going to live tomorrow. Look at all these other people dying around me. There's nothing different about them and me. I could get cancer. I could get hit by a car, right? So you start to doubt. But then that, like, so Melinda, as you're saying, so there is this sense of wavering, yeah, of having both happening at the same time. So now, does that negate what I had just said? Well, probably does. But this is why Geshe-ma is always encouraging you guys to debate, because these kinds of questions come, and you have to. I mean, when we said you have to debate, you don't. I mean, it's good if at some point, and if people want to, we literally, teach, kind of how to the process, the correct or a formal process of debate. That would be very good to learn. But even if not, you can consider in your own thinking and in your discussions, like, wait, does the fact that we have this doubting consciousness here in number 6, does that somehow negate the basic the basic theory premise that you can't have these two cognitive opposites at the same time? And that's a hard question to get clear on. Now, this is another kind of tangent, but just, you might be confused, like, well, why are there all these, like, we have so many clear definitions and these whole categories and everything, it seems like it's so defined, clearly defined. But then every time you ask a question, it seems like it's a debate. Like there's like different things you could say about it. Why is that? Well, it's just because you can't, every person has their own mind, and you have your own background, and you have your own intellect, your own insights. So every person is going to have slightly different questions they take to something. So it's not like the author of these textbooks could like literally put down every single possible doubt or question or rebuttal that you could have to something and then give an answer like that, right? We have to find those answers ourselves. And that is part of the tradition of the Nalanda tradition, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Okay, now let's get to those questions before time runs out. Oh my gosh, time runs out so quickly. Okay, so again, the nature of mind, this unit of experience that's clear and aware. So then to Scott's question, so where can you draw the line of like what kind of entities have that? Or what kind of entities don't have that? Well, this is something that, well, I hate to use the cliche, but it has to be debated. And frankly, it's a question, like so many questions that we're going to have, that I have, right? When I say we, I mean we as Westerners or people to whom Buddhist theory is new in our culture, right? We have these questions like based on our cultural background and, of course, largely science and the scientific understanding of things, the scientific approach to things. So, you know, the Buddhist text, they don't have traditionally an understanding of bacteria and an understanding of cells and an understanding of, right, DNA. Like it's not there. There are some things that can be seen as like related or similar. Okay, but it's certainly just those terms and those precise ways of, right, dividing up the world are not there. So now, how can we can't just open a book and say, okay, this is the answer, Scott. Like that's my point. So we have to actually come to it through reasoning and through looking at what the Buddhist text and what the Buddha and his, the wisest, disciples and commentators, what they did say about the mind. And then of course contemporary masters like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, people who have done extensive study themselves and extensive contemplation about these things. And then look at what modern science is too. There's no reason to dismiss that. In fact, it's the opposite. There's lots of reason to include that in our thinking and our debates. So I would say, in general, there was another Buddhist school at the time of the Buddha called the Jains, and the Jains do accept that plants have consciousness. Okay, and they still exist here in India, right, and everywhere, but largely in India, and the Buddha denied that. Now, I haven't studied that, like that there is those very debates will come up in the course of my studies. I haven't gotten there yet, so I can't really go into any more detail than that. When it comes to things like bacteria, right, maybe amoebas, right, I think that the general rule of thumb that I've heard expressed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama is that, so to determine if something has consciousness, it would be if it's, and that makes it, I mean, when we technically say sentient being, like if we're using that as a direct translation, as the Tibetan word is semchen, if that's which is generally what sentient being is used to translate, that actually doesn't refer to Buddhas. So there's a division, there's a distinction there between Buddhas and sentient beings. But I know what your question is just about beings with mind, right? So put that aside. But how do you determine if a being has a mind? Well, if you can like look at their physical form and they are clearly, right, moving towards a source of pleasure and away from a threat or a source of potential, harm or suffering. Okay, if you can see that they are sort of actively doing that, then what is that? That's a sign, that's a reason that can help us infer, that can be used to infer that they have experience. They have an experience of pleasure, so they're moving towards the pleasurable stimulus. They have an experience of suffering, so they're moving away from the suffering or the threatening stimulus. Not making sense?
Well, no, but if something doesn't have a brain and a capacity to think, but still moves away from cold and heat, a worm or something that just, it moves away from the suffering of heat, but can't really cognize why it's moving away from the heat. So they don't necessarily have a mind, but they're moving away from suffering, nonetheless.
Well, we would say they do have a mind for sure. Yeah, animals. I mean, that's pretty unanimous throughout the Buddhist world. That animals have minds. Again,
something
sorry?
with no brain, with no central nervous system, no brain. Like doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Like they're not cognizing why they're moving away from it. They're just physically, their sensory perceptions are moving away from that.
I think we would probably have to say that they are cognizing something. So
with no
so it's not just
nervous
physical, because that would mean there's no experience of it. But obviously their experience is very different from ours, so it's kind of hard to put yourself in the shoes of a worm or the skin of a worm, right? But maybe Yeah, try it. I mean, try to think what it's like to be, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with like modern, so there's modern psychology, there's also modern, right, philosophy of mind, which is kind of a whole own separate field, you know, that relies heavily on psychology and neuroscience, but is different. And so there's the popular saying that was coined by Thomas Nagel, a philosopher in the 80s, that he talks about what it's like to be a bat. I mean, that's the name of a paper he wrote, but that became a very common way for philosophers to talk about mind and experience. So, you know, a worm, there's something it's like to be a worm. Okay, so that worm has experiences. Do they have, as you know, again, without language, it's hard to imagine what it's like to live without language at all, right? I think that's the big crux of it, right? Just to because what can a concept be without language? It's very hard to imagine, right? But the animals, there's no reason to think that animals wouldn't have that. I mean, that the animals wouldn't have experience because again, they show so much evidence of that. I mean, of course, people do think that, so I shouldn't say there's no reason, but they show a lot of evidence that they have experience. Now, where would you draw the line is another funny question because we do accept in the classical Buddhist presentation of the universe, of the whole, you know, extent of possibilities of beings who have no bodies at all, right? There are whole realms of existence where it's just consciousness, right? Those are called the formless realms. So that's also there. So we can't even perceive those. We just have to basically accept they exist, and they're only accessed through meditation. Those have to be, you know, people are only born into those realms after they've done, you know, specific meditations to access those states. Okay, then Neil's question of the conditions. Okay, so I'll just maybe there's not much time to go into the text anymore, but that's perfect because this is a really important question. So again, now this question, I just want to link it to, you know, when we talk about consciousness and what it is, right? Again, there's these questions of like, is consciousness the brain, right? Is consciousness an emergent phenomenon from the brain, right? How is it connected, right? And then the question of, you know, is conscious sort of what comes first, right? Consciousness or the body or the brain, right? So I think when we understand these three conditions for a consciousness to arise, I think it helps make those kinds of questions very much more clear. So we have three conditions. So one of the conditions is the dominant condition, which again, that's just what allows, you could also just call it the domain condition or the domain specific condition, right? I'm just using different terms to just try and give a little bit of a more intuitive sense of what we're talking about here, because sometimes the technical terms are a little bit, I mean, because, you know, everything's in translation from Tibetan or Sanskrit, the terms sometimes get a little unwieldy, right? So just to use a little more intuitive sense term, it's like the sense is that we're talking about a condition that is domain specific, and that's the condition that enables, right, a given consciousness to access a certain domain of objects. So that's the dominant condition. So that means our sensory organs, right? And then like the kind of the whatever is allowing us to see forms of color and shape, to hear sounds, to smell odors, to taste flavors, to have the tactile sense experience of tactility. And then mental consciousness, well, that you know, that gives access to everything that exists. So that's one thing. Okay, so we do have this condition. So the mind, of course, as a human being, does arise from the body. Of course, we need this dominant condition. So it does arise from the body. Does that mean that mind in general arises from the body, right? That there didn't exist any mind before we had this body? No, It just means that the experiences of this life, once we're embodied as a human, are depending on our sensory organs of this body. Okay, that's the one condition. I know that's not your question, I'm just reviewing, okay? Then the dominant condition. Okay, then the observed object condition. Okay, so our mind, this is a common thing in modern cognitive science, right? A very common perspective is there's so many different ways of talking about this, but in general, we talk about extended cognition. Extended cognition. In other words, that your consciousness, your mind, it's not just created from a sort of top down and only from brain neural activity. It depends on the wider environment around you, around your body. So this is when we learn about the three conditions, it's so obvious, of course. Why? Well, you need objects to perceive. Without objects, okay, without objects, without the observed object, there's no consciousness, okay? Then Neil's question about the immediately preceding condition. Now, again, just to use a little more intuitive language, we can call this like the connectivity, the condition of connectivity. Okay, in other words, it's what connects up, what gives our current moment of mind, right, present moment of mind, connects it to the continuity, prior moments of mind. It allows it to arise, right? Okay, so does it have to be immediately preceding? Well, that's a very good question. Let me just first ask you, what do you think? Does it have to be actually in the very prior moment? Was, I think, the way you worded it, right? The exact prior moment.
Either way, I'm not sure, because either way it seems there'd be a problem, because if it has to be in the previous moment, then like if I take my eye consciousness, I could, for instance, go blind and not have eye sense consciousness, and then later, 10 years later, have a surgery that restores my eyesight. And at the moment I get that surgery, I'm seeing again, but the previous moment of my sense consciousness was 10 years ago.
Right. Very good. Very good. So I'll say two things about this. So first I'll say about it, again, it's another great thing to debate. In other words, you'll be able to make a case for kind of the way you're saying it. And someone else might have actually a different perspective, both who've studied the same material. And you can genuinely have like a really interesting, deep dialogue about like, well, what makes more sense? Okay. But just I'll kind of say from from my perspective, I don't know. I can't say it's even the right one, but we've debated these questions with my classmates, and what I've come up with is like this. So this brings us again back to another big picture review. We have three types of functioning things, right? Which is another way of saying impermanent things. What are those three types? There's matter, right? Those are things composed of particles, essentially. Matter, consciousness, those are all those, right, entities of experience, those units of experience that are clarity and awareness. And then we have something called, again, one of these kind of tough words, but a non-associated compositional factor. Now, another word that's often used, another translation option, is simply abstract composites. I think that one's a little bit more wieldable, right? Wieldy. Abstract composites. So, what are things like abstract composites? Well, when we talked about karma, right? And I know Geshe-ma explained it in a little bit of depth at least. And so you have, the action of saving someone's life. I mean, someone's saving someone's life. You might say, oh, wow, how would I ever have a chance to do that? Or I'm not brave enough to. No, okay, you see an ant in your cup of water and you take it out and put it, you're saving someone's life. Good, okay? So you see that ant in the cup of water, and you take it out carefully, gently, and you maybe say a mantra, give it some extra blessing power, and then you put it down. So you have what? You have a consciousness, the intention to save the life, to help this ant. Okay, you have the physical matter that goes along with it. The body moving, that's matter. Okay. Now, what did I say before? That karma is extremely subtle because it works through these long time gaps. But still, there's somehow a result that can come in a future life. It could be in thousands of future lifetimes. It could be 1,000,000 years in the future. Now, what's connecting that? Well, there's what we call a seed, karmic seed. So the action's done, right? The action's gone, but there's still a karmic seed. What is that karmic seed? It's the potential for some experience to arise in line with, right? Every result has to be somehow in line with or similar to its cause, right? So something in line with saving the life of an ant, what would that be? Something like I said, it could be being born as a human itself, just taking birth as a human. It could be having a long life as a human. It could be having your own life saved at some point, right? Something like that. So that potential is what? That is, out of those three types of impermanent things, functioning things, it is an abstract composite. It's not matter, nor is it consciousness. It's a potential for consciousness and matter to arise. So likewise, when you go blind, right? Or you go to sleep at night, okay? Your eye consciousness kind of shuts down, right? Kind of goes into, well, where does it go? It goes into this mode of a seed, okay? A seed, or I think you might use the term imprint. It's similar. Not exactly the same, but in this case, we could say either, okay? It's a seed or an imprint. Okay, so the question is, so when you have, then you wake up or you get your sight restored and you have that first moment of visual consciousness again, what was the immediately preceding condition, or this condition for connectivity, to connect it up with your prior consciousness? Well, it can be itself a seed. That connectivity or that immediately preceding condition doesn't necessarily have to be a consciousness. It can be a seed. That's one way of answering. And so that way it still would be immediately preceding, like in the exact prior moment. It just wasn't a consciousness there. It was just the potential for the consciousness to arise. Okay. And that when you look at the definition of immediately preceding condition, that fits, right? The definition itself, which I am guessing is in this textbook, but I don't recall. Yeah, I think it was. But anyway, we're so short on time. I'm not gonna. Sorry about the time, but that's one way. Okay, there's another way, which is basically to just say that it doesn't have to be like for an eye consciousness to arise, the immediately preceding condition doesn't have to be a previous eye consciousness. It can be like, for instance, a mental consciousness, and then you have another way another way to do it. And again, this isn't just like semantics and just like trying to cheat the system to get out of the qualm. It's like you really think about it. It's like there's really, again, this is about understanding our mind, so you can really see how a mental consciousness interacts with a visual consciousness, and a visual consciousness interacts with a mental consciousness. And, it's sometimes hard to get the exact answer that's like, oh, this is definitely it. But the whole process of going through these questions, of learning these definitions, and then bringing in these questions and enriching your own reflection, that just deepens your understanding of your own mind as you go along. Okay, any final question? Sorry, we didn't really get into the textbook. This is I'm sorry about that. I just I really didn't think that would take so long. Any questions?
I have a question. Thank you. This is kind of a follow-up to Neil's question. One way to ask is, can a moment of consciousness cognize itself? Or sometimes it's put, is there a reflexivity in cognition or in consciousness? Right? Because I think one of the ways that I understood like the importance of the preceding moment of consciousness is a rejection actually of reflexivity of consciousness, that one moment of consciousness can't cognize itself, and therefore cognition relies upon the preceding moment of consciousness. Is this why like the immediately preceding moment is so important, but actually there's some way in which cognition depends upon like this very momentary view, like that the next moment of cognition only comes about through a preceding moment of consciousness?
Yeah, excellent question and excellent reasoning. to get to your question. And who is that? I'm not sure I recognize the voice.
Sorry. Well, I'm here. Hiding. Yeah. This is Jason. Yeah.
Jason.
Nice to meet
Okay,
you.
Jason.
Yeah, this is our first time. Yeah.
Okay, nice to meet you. Good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. Very good question. Well, okay. That's one of the places where the different paradigms or tenet systems do differ. Okay, whether there's reflexivity or not. But they all accept the necessity for this immediately preceding condition. So where does that leave us? I think for those, I'm not sure that any of the paradigms, as far as I've learned them to this point, they don't really rely on the necessity or the presence of this immediately preceding condition to explain self-awareness of a consciousness knowing itself, or the ability to remember consciousness. Generally the schools who do accept the reflexivity, which is primarily the Sautrantika and Chittamatra and some branches of the Madhyamaka, but not all of them, they use it as an explanatory tool to explain memory. So for instance, when you went out today and you saw the sunset and you saw the colors and you saw the clouds, okay, you saw those objects, but you can also remember the experience of seeing them. You can remember that I saw them, not just when you remember, it's not just remembering sunset, remembering orange and those clouds, it's also remembering I experienced it, I saw it, right? So how do you have a memory of that? Well, it's because that visual consciousness apprehending the sunset also had an aspect which apprehended itself. That aspect is called the zinam, right? The apprehended aspect. The apprehending aspect. The apprehending aspect. That's the reflexivity, or the self cognizing mind, right? What are we calling it in our textbook here? I'm sorry. I know. Am I sharing the screen still?
No.
No. Okay. Well, I just want to make sure I'm not giving you too many terms. Okay. Self-cognizant. Yeah. Self-cognizant. Self-cognizant. Direct cognizant. Okay. So that's that. Okay. So the immediately preceding condition then it's not really used to explain that. What it is used for is to reject the possibility that consciousness can come from a non-conscious, that consciousness can just appear without connecting to a prior consciousness. In other words, that it can come from the brain itself, from matter itself, right? So that's essentially what is being rejected. And so what it's establishing is that for any conscious being, right, any consciousness, really, there is an infinite prior continuity of it, okay, with no pinpointable beginning moment. There's always an infinite prior continuity. So that sort of establishes as conscious beings, as sentient beings, we're infinite. We're here for the long game. We're in it to win it. I mean, it's infinite. The existence of our consciousness. It's kind of mind-blowing when you really absorb that thought, I hope that answered the questions. I mean, that's again one of these questions that, yeah, to be continued, I can say.
No, that was very helpful. That was, yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, well, I guess what I can say is I will end it because the time is up. But if anyone does have any more questions, what you can do is raise your hand, and then we'll kind of formally close the class, but you can come up to the laptop and just ask me your question later. I mean, I can stay. So does anyone still have any question that you want to still address? We're good. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, that's fine. So I'll stay. Yeah, I'll stay as long as I'm here. I don't have anywhere else to go. So let's just do a quick dedication of all of the merit and goodness that we generated, and remembering our initial motivation to be of service to all living beings. So bringing that to the forefront of your mind again. And now, like, offer the energy, the effort, the reflection, the insight. Okay, offer everything we've put into this and gained from it to the benefit of all living beings, to their full awakening, complete elimination of suffering from this world. And you can, I don't remember if you guys are doing prayers, but I'll just recite a couple dedication prayers. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. In the snowy mountain pure land, you're the source of good and happiness. Powerful Tenzin Gyatso Chenrezig, may you stay until samsara ends. Okay, thank you, and so good to see you all. I will actually join next week after class. If anyone wanted to come to kind of discuss about moving forward with Forest of Wisdom, and then also, just so I can answer any more questions or anything, if people had questions about sort of how we came to the decision we did, and anything like that, but just to have that discussion. So that will be at this time next week. Okay, and again, I'll stick around if anyone.
Can I turn off the TV and just leave you on the laptop?
Works for me. Yeah.